So now the first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to start to go through the code and grab the selector and grab the declarations that currently exist and move them into the appropriate spots that we've created inside of our table of contents. As I move these, I'm going to be looking at each selector and seeing if there's any ways that I can optimize the values that have been set for the various properties. Some of these things are not written in the most optimal format, so we're going to see if we can improve that. Most of this code has already been indented, so that makes it pretty easy to read. One of the most important things you can do when you're coding CSS is to indent certain areas of your code so that you can add a little bit of distinguishing characteristics to that area of the code. So let me just show you the difference. This code, as far as from the browser's perspective, could be written like this. So this particular CSS declaration is exactly the same as this one right here, but you'll notice this one is much easier to read, and that's a result of the indenting and the fact that multiple property and value pairs exist on multiple lines. This one, much more difficult to find the information that we're looking for. So the advantage of writing like this is that, yeah, it might shave off a little bit of file size, but the disadvantage is that if you have to make any edits, much more difficult to find what you're trying to augment. This is a much more friendly version. So when we write our rules, it is better for readability to indent multiple property value pairs. Now the exception for that rule is if you have a rule where there's just one property value. So nav wrap down here only has one property. It seems a little bit of overkill to write the rule like this. So what I like to do is when I have rules with only one property value pair, I put those on one line and list them like this. But any rule that has more than one property value pair, I indent those properties and I put each one on its own line. As we go through this file, we'll be looking at the rules, and if they're one property, we're going to change them so that they appear on one line, and the multiple properties will leave on multiple lines. Alright, so we're going to have our global styles appearing first. Global styles are going to be anything that is going to globally affect my page. So these would be things like H1, H2, the body tag, if I had rules on images or links or anything that is specific to just general tags. I like to put those within my kind of global style section of the page. And the way that I organize this content for the most part is I try to kind of set it up alphabetically, but there are some exceptions to that rule just because I like to have the items that also appear in the order that they appear on the page, kind of like top down, or how they appear in the cascade. So I generally do alphabetical, but you'll see in some instances I might change that just because it makes more sense to me. And again, this is whatever makes sense to you. These are things that help me, but you might want to set your page up differently. You don't have to set it up just like I am. You might want to set yours up a little bit differently. So right underneath the ending comment for global styles, I'm going to start with my global styles, and I've pasted this in. And the other thing that I want to do as I go through my page is I want to try to add shorthand wherever possible. Shorthand is a way that I can eliminate a lot of what's going on. So in this particular rule, you can see that I have font family, I have font style, and I have font weight. All of these declarations can actually be combined into shorthand notation, and we'll just use font. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to font right here. And then inside of the font shorthand property, you need to make sure that you always have at minimum the font size and the font family. So there is no font size specified here, so I will need to specify that. Other than that though, you can add or leave off whatever you need to. So I'm going to put normal for the font style, and I'm going to set 400 for the font weight, and then I'm going to set the font family, which in this case is going to be Maven Pro, and then you can see that I have a fallback stack. I have Arial, Helvetica, Verdana, and then sans serif. Again, the default sans serif on most people's system is going to probably be one of these three fonts. So this is a little redundant. I don't need to include all of this on here. My font stack could just be my special Adobe hosted Maven Pro font, and then if that's not available, I'm going to default to a sans serif. You don't need to have these very extensive font stacks. That is once again a little bit of overkill. The other thing that I need to include here is I need to include the font size. If I don't include font size, you'll see if I just save this as is and we go look in the browser, when I refresh, all of my body copy here is going to revert to the default body copy, which in this case happens to be Times. So it actually can't render it without the font size. So I'm just going to set the font size to 100%, which in most browsers is going to be about 16 pixels. But once I do that, if I refresh on my page, you're going to see that as soon as the page refreshes, the body copy is going to switch back to the Maven Pro. So that allows it to work. So that's the one caveat in regards to using the shorthand method of applying font. But you can see that I've eliminated 3 additional lines of code and I've just consolidated them down to 1 line of code. So that's much more efficient. The other thing that I want to have happen here is I'm going to again consolidate some of these rules right here. I have background image, background size, and background attachment. The background attachment and the background image, those can go on the same line. So I'm going to get rid of background image and we're going to use shorthand notation, which is just background. Then I'm going to pull up my background image, and then before I have my semicolon, I'm going to use fixed. And I don't have repeat here, but I'll go ahead and set this to no repeat as well. And then I can get rid of this line of code. Background size is not something you can include in shorthand inside of background, so I'm going to leave background size here. And then we have the max width of 960. Want to leave that on there. And we have the margin, which is already using shorthand notation. It's using 0 and auto. The other thing that I like to do is I like to alphabetically organize my rules. So I'm going to select the background and the background size rules, and I'm going to cut those, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to have them appear first, and then we'll have font, then max width, and then margin. Actually, max width should follow margin, so let's just go ahead and move that. And again, this is the way I prefer to do it. Then when I look at my rules, I know right away that I can find these things and they're going to be organized alphabetically. That just makes it a little bit easier for me to know what's going on. So I find that to be useful. So that's going to be my first rule on the body. Then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to get my H1 and my H2. There are the rules that I want to declare next. So I'm going to cut those, and I'm going to come back up here and we'll paste these into our page. So what we can do here to simplify this and also make it easier if we have to do edits later on is we can use a group selector to be able to group some of these things together. That's going to allow our code to be a little bit cleaner when we group the selectors. So I'm going to make a group selector for H1, H2, H3, and maybe even H4s, and I'm going to specify that the font family be set to the Lolita one and then defaulting to sans serif. Again, I'm going to reduce down the font stack so that it's just the 2 fonts that I'm concerned with. This rule is just going to have this one rule, so I'm going to leave this on 1 line. What this is going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to eliminate this property from the H1 and from the H2. I don't need that anymore. And the advantage is that if I decide I want to change this font to something else, instead of going into every single selector, H1, H2, H3, H4, and changing it, I can just change it in one place. So this is going to make it easier for me to manage what's going on my page. I'm avoiding redundancy by using the selector group. So this can save you a lot of time when you're writing your CSS, and it just is going to streamline the whole process. So whenever you can do that, if you're using shared properties and you find them defined in a bunch of different selectors, see if you can use a group selector to eliminate some of that. So that's one thing that we want to do. We're going to go ahead and we're going to leave this declaration for font size of 2 M's. I'm going to move letter spacing underneath the font size because that's going to follow our alphabetical order. Then what we're going to do here is we're going to add some margin settings. Remember that when we added our CSS reset, it collapsed some of those margins. So we lost some of the spacing on the top and the bottom. So I'm going to set the margin on the top and the bottom to 1em, and on the right and the left that's going to go to 0. Next I will have this text align center appear after this, and then we have our text shadow, and you can see here that I have a redundancy here as well. I have text shadow, and then I'm defining actually two text shadows, applying it to the same selector. So this one is a little redundant, and sometimes when you have code you'll have added something twice. You don't need that, so you want to get rid of those things, and then we'll just eliminate some of the unnecessary line breaks as well. The other thing that I want to have here is I want to add a font size declaration to my H2. When I added my CSS reset, that redefined the size of the fonts right there, so that reduced the size of the font. And I'm going to leave the letter spacing at 1, and then I'm also going to add this margin setting right here, just like we did before. So margin on the top and bottom is going to be 1em, and then on the right and the left it'll be 0, and that will take care of that. We're going to make a rule for paragraph. I don't have any rules currently for the paragraph. There was nothing defined before, but now when we look at our page we can see that there's no spacing between the paragraphs. So I definitely want to include a rule for paragraph. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use one selector. It's going to be margin on the bottom, and I'm going to specify that I want that to be 1em. And since that's just the one selector, I'm going to put that on one line. If we save now and we go refresh in the browser, you're going to see that this section of the page, when the page refreshes, is going to look a lot more like what our original page looked like. So this is nicely fixing a lot of the things that were wrong with this page. So now this looks much better by just adding a couple of these rules. I'm going to look at my page again, and I'm scrolling down here. This is the footer, so that's going to go in the footer section, so we'll leave that. Nav is going to go in the nav and header section. We have this section left and section right. We're going to place those inside the kind of main body section. We have header, that would go inside header. Logo is going to go up by header. Then I have some rules for A and A hover. Well, those are general rules that are affecting my links. So I'm going to cut those and I'm going to put those back up here in my global styles. Now, normally we would have the A tags come before the body tag, but my preference is to define body, and then I know it doesn't follow my rule about alphabetical order. I like to define the H1s, the paragraphs, the lists, and then I would define links. So I'm going to actually put my links down below. And again, that's just my method of doing this. If you have another way of doing this that makes more sense to you, feel free to come up with a method. The thing that you want to keep in mind is consistency. So whatever works for you, whatever you find to be the best method of setting up your CSS, be consistent. That's going to help so that every single time you build a website, you're using that same format, and you'll find that pretty soon you'll be able to reuse a lot of the methods in which you're building your web pages. So that's going to become more streamlined, and you'll probably even be able to reuse some of your CSS. So you can see how I've gone through and now set up my global styles, and I've reduced any sort of redundancy. I've changed some of these selectors to shorthand. I've eliminated things that were happening multiple times, and I've really been able to kind of consolidate some of the code, which is always going to be your goal.